Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Lunch and Learn webinar series today here at the Temple Health and Bioscience District. Today, we're going to be talking about medical device pricing. We're going to learn how to segment the market, develop the right offerings, and price medical device products to sell. Our featured speaker today, we have Mike Lawson. He's the Managing Director of Pinnacle Pricing and consults with clients on topics ranging from pricing strategy to market segmentation to new product development. Mike has worked across a wide range of industries, including software, industrials, pharmaceuticals, and medical devices. He's co-authored several white papers on pricing and frequently speaks at industry events, including our big THBD annual conference that's happening this Friday. So we're excited to have him twice this week. But before I hand it away, I just want to give a few quick reminders to those of you who are tuning in online. Number one, feel free to ask questions at any time throughout the presentation. You have a little questions panel, questions tab over on your control panel, so feel free to drop your questions in there and we'll address them all at the very end. And you also have a handout tab over there, so Mike's presentation is there for you to download, so if you want to keep that and refer back to it later, you have access to that. I think that covers pretty much everything, so Mike, feel free to take it away.
Okay, awesome, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So you see my subtitle here, it doesn't matter what it costs, it matters what it's worth. Just to give you a little backstory on that comment, several years ago, I took a pricing class as part of my MBA. And of course, bought the textbook ahead of time, and it was, I don't know, at that time, probably $80, $85. And of course, you know, we all know textbooks are expensive, whether you're undergraduate, graduate, it doesn't matter. But for me, it was money that was well spent. And in that pricing class, the first comment the professor made when he held up the textbook, he said, you know, it doesn't matter what it costs, it matters what it's worth. And I've always carried that comment with me. And that investment, both in that pricing class and in that textbook, has done me very well over the years. So when you think about value, you think about pricing, think about what things are worth rather than what it costs. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into the presentation. And excuse me, just want to talk a little bit about the current environment in medical device pricing. If you're on the selling side, picture yourself in heavy negotiations. We know where healthcare has gone over the past several years. And if you're on the buying side, think about what you do to those salespeople, those executives, and those vendor companies that you're dealing with. And when you think about that, here's what I would say the current environment medical device pricing is. Regardless of who you are, you're being put through the buzzsaw, and it is just a bad environment when it comes to pricing. Of course, price is like water, where it will go to the lowest point, but there is a lot of value in different products and services that are sold, and the challenging environment within medical device makes it tougher, but it can still be overcome. So with that, let's talk about some of the headwinds in medical device pricing. You know, the first is probably the value analysis committees, which, you know, again, if you're on the buying side and you haven't implemented these, I'm sure you're well on your way. And if you're on the selling side, you've probably encountered these committees as well. Definitely a very challenging environment, and you have to make sure you have all your facts, data, and your story straight. Otherwise, your medical device will not be approved. Another headwind is government regulation. Working within healthcare for several years, I would say from a pricing perspective, especially as a practitioner, government regulation of medical device or pharmaceutical is far and above tougher in that environment than any other industry that I've worked in. So you definitely have to understand what the government regulations are, and of course the constant changes that occur with government regulation. Sales and marketing processes. You know, sales and marketing, if you don't have the right story, you haven't done your due diligence, and you don't understand how to walk in and have a different conversation, those processes themselves can become a hindrance to making sure that you're maximizing both the price and the profitability that you gain when you sell a medical device. Third-party benchmarking. If you haven't heard of ECRI, you know, it's one of the larger third-party benchmarkers out there. And I couldn't tell you the number of corporate account directors I worked with to few Cynthies that always talked about, well, we were told that the hospital benchmarked us and here's where our price should be. It's out there, it's real, it's only getting stronger. So you have to understand that how to deal with third-party benchmarking and also where the data comes from. And then of course the final headwind, and I'm sure there's many others, is price transparency. I am someone who believes that price transparency is actually a very good thing, but what it means as sellers and manufacturers of medical device products, we have to understand our products, the value they provide. We have to segment the market correctly, and we also have to have the right offering structure. So let's touch on a couple of different types of government regulations. The first are going to be the general pricing regulations. If you haven't heard of these, the Sherman and Clayton Antitrust Acts deal primarily with price fixing and price discrimination. And by the way, price discrimination is legal. You just have to make sure that you do things a certain way. So I'm not going to cover too much on that piece, but just understand that these are some of the older acts that have been around and have really regulated corporations, both within medical device and also across all industries. The one I will talk a little bit more about is Robinson-Patman. And let me just give you an example of Robinson-Patman. If you're selling to two very similar size hospitals that are directly across the street from each other, they both have the same patient base, they both do the same types of procedures, and are similar in every possible way, Robinson-Patman could affect you. However, Robinson-Patman, while it talks about bundling, it talks about having equal price for equal customers and price discrimination, there are a couple of saving graces for Robinson-Patman. And one of those is services. So if you offer services above and beyond just a medical device, or it's included in the offering that you have, there's a way around Robinson-Patman. And the bigger defense against Robinson-Patman is much more around cost to serve. So again, if you're dealing with two very similar hospitals across the street and you have a very similar cost to serve, there's no defense against Robinson-Patman. But if there's even the slightest difference in cost to serve, you can easily price discriminate to those two hospitals that are across the street from each other. Now, before I go into more medical specific government regulations, I will tell you my disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, so anything I talk about, definitely if you're looking at the legal implications of pricing, I would recommend that you contact your legal team and make sure that all those things are addressed and your questions are answered. That said, I do have a couple of recommended legal pricing experts if you're interested, and I can definitely steer those people your way. So let's move into some of the healthcare compliance regulations. I'm going to go probably back to the 1990s, where things got really tough within the pharmaceutical industry. We know how the pharmaceutical companies would provide all sorts of ski weekends, weekend trips to the Bahamas for doctors, prescribing doctors, all sorts of things that occurred. And about 5 or 10 later, the same thing happened with a medical device. So as a result, several statutes were put into place. And the one I'll focus on exclusively here is the federal anti-kickback statute. And the interesting thing about that is, of course, you can't provide any sorts of trips or expensive dinners, anything of huge value to a medical device surgeon or doctor. And if you actually read the letter of that law, the interesting thing is you really can't even sell medical devices to the healthcare industry. So what the government did was create safe harbors that allow discounting and a few other practices that actually allows medical device companies to be able to sell those products into healthcare type or hospital type systems. So the government really went way, way, way conservative and has slowly walked back a little bit. But these are the types of regulations that will definitely get you in trouble. And if you get blacklisted from being able to sell or within the medical device industry, you're pretty much done for. You're going to have to find a different industry to work in. So understanding the regulatory environment is incredibly important when it comes to pricing medical devices. And before we actually move on to the good stuff, I do want to touch on one other thing that is worthwhile knowing, and that's the generally prohibited pricing practices. So the first is any sort of pre-date. So if you enter into a contract agreement today that says you're going to give rebates dating back to January 1st of this year, that's a no-go. That will definitely get you into legal trouble. Don't want to do it. Stay away from predates. Below cost concessions. There's going to be a couple of other things that I covered that talk about giving away value for essentially nothing, or giving something or selling something below cost. Within the healthcare environment, again, we can't do this. It is not a good practice, and it will definitely get you into legal trouble. Funding of co-payments. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. Don't want to cover any sort of co-payments when it comes to selling medical device. Everything has to be incredibly above board. A couple of others, fee per switch. So if you want to take an orthopedic device, for example, and you say, hey, doctor, for every Smith & Nephew knee that you use opposed to a Zimmer Biomet knee, we will pay you X dollars. Don't do it. Not a good practice, and definitely illegal. Swapping arrangements. Think about swapping different types of Medicare payments. There's a few other things out there. Illegal. Don't want to go there. Bad practice. And then outcome-based risk pricing. Obviously, when it comes to outcomes, there have to be the very strong efficacy-based studies that are out there to help communicate different pricing. So you don't want to be, if you get 30 years out of my knee replacement, maybe that's worth a little bit to you, doctor. Again, bad practice, definitely do not want to go there. So now that we've covered off some of the legal constraints that are out there when it comes to medical device pricing, there are definitely actions that we can take to appropriately price medical devices. And although the next several minutes are going to be talking about something that's slightly outside pricing, I'm going to wrap it all together at the end so you can see how pricing is actually much more effective by doing these things. And one of the first things you can do is gather the voice of the customer. It's really, really the key to value. And the way you do this is by having conversations with key stakeholders. And I think you could do this from a sales consultant perspective, corporate accounts, the VP of marketing, VP of sales, your C-suite, walking in and having conversations with different stakeholders in a hospital. And the three I'm going to focus on, and you'll see this in a few minutes as well, is the surgeon, the doctor, or clinical buyer. Those are the ones who definitely want to know that clinically and from an outcome-based perspective, you have the right medical device and it's the best medical device. Of course, you have to include hospital administration. Those tend to be much more of the purchasers, whether it's a CFO or you're dealing with that procurement agent sitting across from you in a negotiation. And then the third would be the OR staff. Think of OR nurses, think of those technicians that are sanitizing instruments. So all those people that are really in much more of a support role. And the key with these conversations is that they're interview-based and not survey-based. I think we tend to be a much more focused society. Let's do a survey and see what we can find out. Let's do some conjoint analysis. Well, the key to voice of the customer is having that open conversation and not really having a sales call, but really understanding the needs and what those different stakeholders of surgeons, hospital administration, and OR staff value. And interviews give you the ability not only to read that body language, but also to ask those follow-up questions that can lead you down a very different path to really understand the value that's provided or the value that's needed from those different types of clinical, hospital administration, or OR staff stakeholders. And the best part is interviews can be and by their nature are very open-ended. Of course, you don't want to have a yes/no type questionnaire. It's more of a, well, tell me about, what about this? How does that work? So those open-ended types of questions are much better in terms of those interview-based type of qualitative research. So what are the VOC, or voice of customer interviews? Essentially semi-structured conversations, and you have that interaction to really understand how you can affect that interviewee's business. And again, that depends on whether you're talking with that surgeon, that hospital administration, or that OR staff type of stakeholder. And we'll talk in a few minutes about having those different types of conversations, but you really, really have to focus on the interview and understanding that voice of customer. And you can definitely probe for a lot more detail than surveys. Surveys are great, by the way, to follow up after you've done quite a bit of qualitative research, because then you can reach a much broader audience, and it gives you the ability to confirm or deny those things that you had heard in an interview. And oh, by the way, most of the time, and I say what I mean by most of the time is over 99%, you're really confirming all of those things in a survey that you heard in an interview. And of course, you do want to follow a general interview guide. And the point of this is to make sure you have consistency across interviews. And if you have different interview teams, there's consistency as well. I know from doing this in a lot of my experience, it's very easy to go off topic, just given the way the conversation is going. But I always tend to come back to the interview guide to make sure certain points are touched on and hit upon. So what's not included in gathering voice of customer? It's not a sales call. You're not there to sell anything. Basically, you're there to ask questions and to listen. You do not want to sell a thing. And you don't want to do any sort of pre-sales analyses. Quite frankly, voice of customer needs to be, those setup conversations between the C-suite and the hospital, or it needs to be done, throughout the course of a customer relationship. If you get into that 6-month window where you're starting to enter a new negotiation for another contract, that is not the time to be gathering voice of customer. And I do want to give you one example from a real life example when I worked at Depew Synthes. We had a sales team in a certain part of the country that wanted to train some new sales consultants. And it's pretty standard practice. You take a few sales consultants into an operating room, get them up to speed, and it's a great way to train and a great way to get those sales consultants introduced to that OR, hospital administration, or clinical staff. The problem was we were engaged in a heavy negotiation at that point in time, and the customer had clearly communicated, we don't believe a sales consultant should be in an operating room. So while we were doing the right thing by training our sales consultant, we were doing it at the wrong time and at the wrong place. If we would have done it with a different health system, it would have been much better. Or if we would have went to, or just waited until the contract negotiation was over, that also would have been acceptable. But by having those sales consultants in the room training at the time, think about voice of customer and what they were saying, and we totally violated it in terms of looking at this even from a pre-sales analysis type of situation. Product scoping. Again, you're there to talk much more about business terms, business relationships, not about individual products. However, there are times where it's great to walk into a surgeon and say, hey, we're thinking about this type of product. I want to get your feedback on that. And in a couple minutes, I'm going to cover a very specific example on how voice of customer was gathered and turned into a very good document for both sales and marketing to use to have those types of conversations with the right buyers in the hospital. Feature analyses, again, don't want to talk about features of products, so it does tie back into the individual product piece. And of course, any sort of price sensitivity analysis, don't want to do that. Would you be willing to pay more for this over that? Not the right place for that conversation. And quite frankly, price sensitivity is actually measured better through surveys as a follow-up rather than in a detailed voice of customer setting. So I had mentioned a couple minutes ago about some voice of customer research that was done, and it led to a very interesting document for a product that was being developed. And this particular product was for a distal radius fracture. And of course, if you know anything about orthopedic procedures, you've got these instrument trays, you've got all these different sizes of medical devices. So it can become very complex and expensive very fast. However, this particular product basically had the tools and the medical devices in different sizes set up in these little kits that were pre-sterilized and ready to go. And if you begin to think about the value behind that and what surgeons would say about that, you can begin to understand a value story that can actually be put together. And it's one that really doesn't even touch on specific numbers without the efficacy studies behind it. And from a healthcare compliance perspective, that's always a challenge. But it gives the right talking points to be able to talk through some of the value that is available and provided by this particular product. So if you look at one of the first things that was talked about, time savings. So you have time and expense that is required to sterilize instrument trays. And even if you're doing one procedure after another, you still have to go through and re-sterilize all those instrument trays. And then, of course, it always happens. You have that sterile blue wrap that is around those instrument trays, and if it gets punctured, guess what? You got to take that instrument set, put it back through the sterilization process. So imagine if you had everything in one little tote, maybe about the size of a book, a good hardcover book, that had all the instruments and medical devices right in that set. Creates a lot of time savings, especially with OR time and being able to keep procedures moving forward. Another would be reduced case disruptions. So instruments have never been used. There's no question about what's going on with those instruments. Already talked about the pack is stocked, sterile, ready to go, low risk of case disruption. You just peel the seal back and you're ready to go. Oh, and guess what? What if you actually drop one of those instruments? Again, go back to the disruption that would cause. What if you were just able to open up a pack that had nothing but replacement instruments in it, and you can just keep the process moving with very, very little disruption? So you can begin to see the value that by having these conversations with surgeons and understanding what they value in terms of OR time and procedures, this type of product was actually very beneficial. And these were some of the statements we heard directly back. Another one, the tray is less than 1 pound. These instrument trays, heavy, 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 especially if you're looking at a knee replacement, a hip replacement. And if it's a revision, it's not uncommon to walk in with 5 to 10 of these instrument trays based on what the needs are of the surgeon and the OR staff. So having something that's small, complete, ready to go, very efficient. 1 part code per procedure. So think about medical billing, think about all those things in terms of reimbursement, being able to track the right implant to the patient, to the procedure, and that episode of care. And having that 1 part code is actually very, very easy to track back, especially if you're using a barcode type system. And then, of course, you are eliminating and reducing complexity for the OR team. So think of that sales consultant that, even today stands there with their laser pointer and points to different instruments to help the surgical team out. Everything is in one little tote ready to go. And yes, the sales consultant is there in case anything comes up. But again, the efficiency that is gained from using this type of product goes a long, long way. And then finally, pre-sterilized, touched on some of these things. You don't have to worry about piercing that protective blue wrap. Everything's ready to go. And of course, nothing, because these are disposable instruments, has been exposed to prior surgeries. And of course, that's a risk that none of us like to talk about, but we know that is inherent in the process if you're using reusable instruments. So as I've gone through this, all of this output was gained by talking about this particular product before it hit market in terms of the design, what it would do for both a patient and the clinical customer, and the value that would be provided around this particular product. And the punchline behind this is when I was doing pricing, we were approached by the product design team and they said, well, we want to go out at a discount against the next best competitive product. And as soon as we started learning a little bit more and then worked through a half-day session, they easily said, we can go out at a 20% premium and we know we can justify the price behind it. So that voice of customer research, especially at the beginning, was incredibly important to be able to put together this document and then lead to training the sales teams and marketing teams to have that right conversation. As part of that voice of customer research, and as the hospital purchasing environment has changed, you have to be willing and able to have different conversations with different stakeholders in a hospital. And I'm going to touch on each one of these in a little more detail. But the first would be the technical case. So think about the surgeon who's really worried about the clinical application of that medical device. The second would be the personal case. And that would be the OR staff and how their life is made easier and much more efficient through whatever medical device or process is being sold to them. And then, of course, the third is the business case when you're dealing with hospital administration and also procurement. So thinking about the technical and research case, definitely focus on the surgeon. You want to talk about the efficacy of the product, those value dossiers that go in a ton of detail. All these things are very important when you're talking to the surgeon. And you really want to talk about the features and benefits of the solutions. And in my world, when it comes to pricing, features are good, benefits are better, but making that final leap to value is actually the best thing that you can do. And what you can have the surgeon make that leap to the value that's being really focused on. I would say, in general, every medical device company is an expert at this today already. Can they get better? Absolutely. But I think this has been the core foundation of medical device companies and how they develop products and the rigorous approval process that you have to go through. So again, already experts there today. Just be willing and ready to take it to the next level. So let's talk about the next type of conversation, and that would be the personal case. Again, focus on a hospital staff, OR nurses, technicians, all those people that have a tough supporting role, and anything that you can do with your medical device process or service that makes their life easier is definitely a story you want to be able to talk about. What are you doing to make their life easier? If you don't have to put as much through the sterilization process or worry about that puncture blue wrap and chasing down new instrument trays, that kind of stuff makes the personal case conversation very, very easy. And I think this is a very untapped resource for value and value communication. Again, conversations can be had about value that's being provided, and it can be done in a way where you're not talking specific numbers unless you have those efficacy studies, but it's something that people would tend to gravitate towards and understand that value that is being provided. And of course, the business economic case, this is always the purchasing type conversation. It's a conversation you gotta be ready to have with a C-suite and with purchasing. And this is one that I think is probably the most important because obviously these are the primary decision makers, especially from a financial and economic perspective. It's great if doctors or surgeons say, I want to use XYZ medical device, but if you're not listed on the formulary or you're not approved within the contract, this is a conversation that we'll have when you're actually selling and pricing medical devices. Really focus on the economic value and differentiation. As I think about a recent piece of business that I went after, it was for a client that introduced a new level of artificial intelligence with CAT scans where you could use older machines, but the artificial intelligence actually required much lower doses of radiation. And once you begin to play that out a little bit, obviously children that go through CAT scans and are exposed to high level doses of radiation, long-term effects can be much more catastrophic. However, if you could eliminate 50 to 80% of that radiation dose, those types of medical devices or capital types of equipment become much more valuable to the economic buyer. And you really have a great patient and clinical story as well. So thinking through how a capital piece of equipment plays within the entire scope of healthcare, focus on that economic value and differentiation. And of course, that leads to how you segment the market and how you also define the right offerings. And ultimately, if you do this correctly, you force self-selection of customers. If you remember a few slides ago in Headwinds, I talked about price transparency. And the reason I believe price transparency is actually a good thing is if you have the right offerings and the right products and medical devices out there, you force self-selection where customers choose what they want based on the value that's being provided, rather than just entering into a price negotiation. And without any of this stuff I've been talking about recently, everything will become a price negotiation. So what I would ask, and just think about this, is who has the pricing power within your organization? Does it lie with finance? Are they just purely driven on margins? Does it lie with sales? Or are they just trying to close the deal at any price possible? Potentially leaving money and or business on the table. If you think about contracting, as medical device buyers or those hospital systems have become 2005, 2006, and it's only gotten much more challenging. They are coming back asking for very specific contracts and very specific pricing. So in turn, as a provider of medical devices, does your contracting arm have that pricing power, or does it lie elsewhere? Marketing. I would always argue that from a product perspective, marketing, especially product managers, own the P&L, and they need to for those individual products. On the flip side, when you look at an entire pricing strategy or even contract strategy for specific customers, hospital systems, it needs to be much more of a corporate type strategy that needs to be employed. But that doesn't mean that marketing's focus on the P&L for their individual products is not important. And then, of course, R&D. Think about R&D for pharmaceuticals, think about R&D for medical devices. There's a lot of money, time, and investment that goes into research and development. Naturally, they're going to want a piece of it. Naturally, they want to keep a lot of that money coming back into the company and back into their R&D so they can develop better products and services. So just think a moment about who has the pricing power in your organization. And it could be somebody who's not even, or a functional area that's not even listed up here. But at the end of the day, you've got to have trust among pricing, sales, and marketing. And when you don't have when you don't have that trust, it creates confusion. And with that lack of trust also becomes a lack of collaboration. So again, it comes to who owns value and who owns pricing. And I've often heard pricing groups referred to as the, don't want to sell anything, just focus on high price type group. And of course, I've heard pricing groups talk about sales saying, oh, these are just the give it away guys. So that type of environment, creates a lack of trust, and you want a healthy level of tension, and you want everybody to be aware what the strategy is and how to execute that strategy. So you don't want pricing to be minimized. Pricing is a very important thing. As you go and look at what is measured on Wall Street, revenue and profitability. And pricing should be focused primarily on growing profits and growing revenue when it's appropriate. Overall corporate type of function to become minimized. Different outcomes. I talked about, sales wants this, pricing wants that, marketing wants something different, and of course, finance wants margins. If you don't have that trust, you are going to have different outcomes, and it's not going to be good for the organization. And then, of course, product-focused marketing. Yes, you want to be able to focus on the product, but again, the entire pricing strategy and contracting strategy that should be used as you're looking at dealing with those healthcare companies. So it's much more than just dealing with a specific product. We also must use data. One of the best pieces of data that I found to especially combat conversations with third-party benchmarkers is nothing more than a scatter plot. And if you look at the y-axis, that's price. You look at the x-axis, that's volume. So your dangerous area is to the left of that quantity line, in that you've got prices all over the map. Once you start to get beyond 100, pricing becomes a little more consistent, which is good, and that's really what you want. But in that 0 to 100, type of quantity, it's a very, very bad situation. So the interesting thing in how we were able to use this type of data was to coach different corporate account directors that we knew were walking into negotiations where third-party benchmarking was being used. So the hospitals would come back and say, well, we've had you benchmark, and here's where we think your price should be. And interestingly enough, we'd walk in with this, and of course we hit everybody's data except for that one hospital or hospital system we were negotiating with, and say, well, we've actually benchmarked you against like customers as well, and you're actually getting a pretty fair price. And it was interesting how the conversation would shift immediately from focusing on price to, do we have the more valuable implants? Is the service better? Are our sales consultants better? And focused on all those things that, centered around pricing, but never talked about pricing directly. Again, very simple piece of data. And if you're not doing this today, this is definitely one thing you want to take a look at. But of course, you can't ignore the clinical customer. They are obviously the ones who are making sure the patients are being taken care of, and they're there to do the right thing. But you still have that clinical, you still have that hospital administrator, and you still have that OR staff that you've got to be able to talk to. And again, I want to go back to the prior slide. Data is one of those things that will help you have that conversation. So as I begin to wrap up, what are some of the things or steps that you can take today for better medical device pricing? The first is understand your constraints. I spent probably a good 5 to 10 minutes talking about government regulation. Within healthcare medical device, you have to understand this environment. You have to have your legal teams involved and know the box that you can work within. So that's one of the best things you can do, because I don't think any of us want to go to jail. Second, gather and understand that voice of customer. Again, spent quite a bit of time on that. But once you understand and comprehend the value that is provided, then you can create, communicate, convince, and capture all of those things. So that way you're walking away feeling good at a high level of profitability, and your customer, whether it's the clinical, whether it's the hospital administration, or whether it's the OR staff, feel much better about buying your particular medical device. Segment and develop your offerings to support your customers. So another quick example here, worked with one of the knee teams that was developing a new knee platform and had its own set of instruments that were being sold along with it. However, the instruments came in two types. One was reusable and the other was single-use instruments for the procedure. So if you think of a large orthopedic hospital, they really wouldn't have any interest in those single-use type of instruments. They were doing enough procedures and had enough of the knee replacement instruments in the queue that they could easily replace what they needed to if the blue wrap was pierced. Think about a smaller community type hospital. Maybe they weren't keeping their sterilization procedures going all day. They would be much more of a candidate for the single-use type of instruments. So knowing and segmenting your market and knowing what they need and knowing the offerings to put into place would say, okay, large orthopedic hospital, they're good with reusable instruments, as part of our knee procedures. But we've had this huge opportunity to actually sell these disposable instruments to these smaller community type hospitals. Think about the right pricing model to deliver and capture value. A few minutes ago, I talked about a potential client that invented some artificial intelligence software to read CAT scans. They could have sold the software, the hardware outright to their customers. But another way to look at this was from a subscription pricing model, in terms of per use. So there are different types of models out there, that can deliver and capture the right amount of value. So think about the different options that are out there and available to you. And then, of course, the big job is communicate and capture. So thinking about marketing, putting together the right sales tools, the right marketing messages, training the sales teams to go out and have that different conversation, or to be able to have different types of conversations with all the stakeholders in the hospital. Those are all the things that will enable you to go out and communicate appropriately to the stakeholders. And then, of course, you want your piece of it, as well does the buyer. You definitely want to make sure you're achieving the right level of profitability based on what you're providing in the marketplace. So covered quite a bit over the past 40, 45 minutes or so. And, as I think about this, there are many, many different directions pricing can go with medical devices. And what I attempted to show you was just one small facet in terms of gaining the voice of customer and how you can begin to shape some of that research into coming up with a right pricing strategy or thinking about pricing differently. So again, a lot of different ways to go with pricing. Perhaps there's a webinar in the future to focus on pricing models. But I hope you've enjoyed the past 45 minutes or so, and thank you. And I guess it's going to be open for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. A lot of great information, and I know we've got some questions here, so I'll let them take it away.
Hey, Mike, if you have a device that's novel and there's no direct competition in the marketplace currently, how do you draw your comparison data to be able to show the hospital or the buyer?
So I'm going to answer that question a couple of different ways. One is, if this is just a totally new type of device, and I'll give an example more from the pharma side, hepatitis C. That whole market was created, I don't know what, 20 or 30 years ago. Really never existed. It was found, so that's something brand new and different. With that, there was a very different way to approach pricing, rather than if you could actually reference something very similar going on in that industry or going on today. So if it's pure greenfield, that's where I think going out and getting that voice of customer is incredibly important, even before you begin to develop or think about marketing that device. You have to understand how it's going to change the buyer's perception and need and want to buy that particular new call it groundbreaking medical device. And there are some ways actually to approach how to price it. One is making sure you're using very targeted type of pricing and testing to develop some of that data to help you in turn come up with that economic value and that pricing strategy. So that's thinking about a greenfield, brand new, groundbreaking medical device. I would say oftentimes, regardless of the industry, what we're looking at is something that's probably new and different, but you can always go back to a reference type product, and I would call it the next best competitive alternative. And you want to learn as much about that particular device or product, learn all the ins and outs, what's valued, what's not valued, why it's successful, why it's not successful, and then that becomes your baseline for beginning to price that new medical device product. So a couple of different ways to look at it. I think it just really depends on whether it's new, groundbreaking, nothing like it before, or if it is actually just more of an iteration of something that's already out in the marketplace.
Perfect, thank you.
Hey, Mike. I was wondering, could you touch a little on how to factor in warranties and service packages into your pricing models?
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. So yeah, I talked about one of the things, from a regulation perspective, and this is just pricing wide, not medical device specific, and that's Robinson-Patman. And what you just mentioned is one of the ways around Robinson-Patman that as a seller of products, you'll win every single time. And that's through those warranties and service level agreements. So we know that regardless of what product it is, what industry, you're going to have X%, and hopefully it's like 0.00001 that will fail over time. And of course, you provide warranties based off of that. So understanding that data in terms of how much is going to fail and around the timeline enables you to put into the right warranty perspective. When it comes to service level agreements, that could cover just about everything. And I think really understanding the value, and again, I'm going back to value as opposed to price, understanding the value of those different things to the buyers makes the largest difference in terms of how you can actually then go back and appropriately price those types of things. And really, in my experience, you make all of your money or most of your profits on those service level agreements and warranties as opposed to the individual products themselves. There's exceptions to everything, but to me, that's really where you can begin to differentiate and really hit the ball out in the park when it comes to profitability.
Thanks.
I got a question online for you really quick. It says, given the lack of pricing transparency, how do you find competitor prices to benchmark against? Are providers willing to provide that information?
So this is I would call it a pretty big gray area today. I know there's a lot of medical device companies that write in non-disclosure clauses within their contracts to make sure that customers cannot share their prices with third-party benchmarkers. At the end of the day, I think a lot of it happens anyway, and that those non-disclosures are probably not even worth the paper that they're written on. But one major company from a medical device perspective, ECRI, you can actually join a membership with them and buy all sorts of third-party pricing data. And while you may not know the exact company and exact date something was purchased at a particular price, mining through that data and having a little bit of understanding in the industry, you can figure things out rather quickly. There's also Medicare data that is available. Getting a hold of that, you can see how many Medicare procedures are done at particular hospitals and at what price. So there's a lot of data that is out there today that can be mined that can really help you do that. And there is one other tactic, again, completely legal. Recommend checking with your legal department on this. But if you're in the middle of a negotiation and a customer comes back and says, I am able to get XYZ product at XYZ price from XYZ competitor, you actually have a legal right to say, show me that document, and then it's based on your assessment whether that's a legitimate document or not. But that is another way that you can actually gain competitive pricing, and it's all above board and it's all absolutely legal. So different ways to do it, but I think it would definitely also depend on the type of medical device and the type of procedure that you would be supporting with that medical device. So hopefully that answers the question.
Great, thank you.
And I have one more real quick here. Basically, let's say you have a medical device that says $1,000 to make, and you'll sell it at a profit of $200. But you have a supporting item that would go on there that would make you more revenue, as far as it would sell for $20, but it only costs $1 to make. Would you say that it would be better to give away that large medical device and have that supporting medical device that has to be there for the large one, and have them spend money on the small one rather than the full package? So, that makes sense.
I need to give the standard consulting answer here, and that would be, it depends.
Yeah.
And you think about a couple of different examples. One would be, the razor blade handle and the razor blade, or the color printer, and then the cartridges that go along with it. So, obviously the companies like Gillette, Schick, they make all their money off of the razor blades, not off of the razor blade handle. And then of course you look at the printers, HP, Lexmark, whoever else is out there, they make all their money off of the cartridges, not off of the actual print. So, depending on whether, those smaller priced items are going to be consumable, at a higher rate than the actual medical device, yeah, it may be worth looking at it that way. So from that perspective, yes, I would actually focus on the smaller dollar value that it's much more higher margin. If you look at, say, hip or knee implants, the instruments that actually go behind and support the procedures are incredibly expensive. And unless hospitals buy those instruments outright, and that opens up a whole can of worms even to start this conversation, that's much more of a capital type expenditure, where the actual implant itself becomes much less expensive. So what a lot of medical device companies have done when it comes to instruments, have actually focused on providing the instruments as part of the value of the actual medical device. So again, a slightly different model, and a lot of that is also driven by healthcare compliance. But I would say a couple of different ways to look at it, and it would depend on the individual situation.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Perfect. Well, we're at perfect timing. Does anyone else have any more questions? I think we got them all answered. Thank you so much, Mike. I just want to remind everybody that his presentation is included in the handout. So if anybody wants to download it and keep that, you're welcome to. And you can talk to Mike on Friday, because he's going to be at our annual conference, which I encourage everyone to go sign up for that. It's free, and it's building on last year's conference. Last year we were talking about how to build a startup from the ground up. This year we're kind of just building on that and talking about the next stages of developing and commercializing your business. And Mike's going to be on a panel talking about the future of the medical device industry. So yeah. So the easiest way to get signed up for that is just to go to our website, templebioscience.org, and you'll see it on our news and events calendar. So just click on that, get signed up. It's completely free. So make sure to do that. But thank you again, Mike. Do you have anything else to add?
Not that I can think of. I look forward to seeing everyone on Friday.
Perfect. Yeah, awesome. Well,
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks again. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye.